Hey everyone, so in this video, we're going to talk all about mental APM. We're going to talk about how to build habits around mental APM and how we can use these things to improve faster. As always, everything is timestamped below, and let's get into it. So right now, you're probably thinking, Shok, what is mental APM? So let me explain it to you. Basically, APM stands for actions per minute, and you guys have probably heard this before. It's basically just like how much stuff you do in a minute, like how many keys do you press, how many right clicks do you do, stuff like that. That's your APM. Now, your mental APM is how much stuff you think about at any given time. And League of Legends is a game that taxes your mental APM pretty heavily. There's a lot of stuff to think about pretty much every stage of the game, and it's something pro players are very good at, and it's also something that's kind of hard to show. If you guys have watched some of my fully explained videos, you'll probably see that I'm thinking about a lot of things at a time. So I'm going to show you a few examples of all the stuff that you could be thinking about. Here's a laning example. So you can think about things like, okay, you can think about your teammates' positions, you can think about your wave state, you can think about cooldowns, vision, gold, like reset timers. Basically, there's a huge amount of stuff that you can think about at any given time. Let me give you another example, this time a macro example. So from a macro point of view, you might be thinking about stuff like, okay, what's the next objective? You might be thinking where your teammates are. You might be thinking about how much gold you have and do you need to base. You might be thinking about your lack of vision. You might be thinking about lane assignments, all that sort of stuff. So in the mid game as well, there's a ton of stuff to think about. And to give you a team fighting example, you might be thinking about stuff like, what are the most important cooldowns? Who are the most important targets to focus? Where are my teammates? What is my identity? Like, what are we going to do after this team fight? How do I use my sums? There's just at every point of the game, I really want you guys to realize this, there's a ton of stuff that you can think about. So you always need to be kind of keeping your mind active, thinking about all this sort of stuff. So obviously it would be very easy for me to just leave it at that, tell you guys that you need to just think more, and that might help you. But what I think is that because there is so much stuff to think about at any given time in League of Legends, there's two big problems. The first is that it's just really overwhelming. It's very hard to remember all the stuff to think about, and it can just be too much a lot of the time. And the second thing, and perhaps the more important thing, is not all the information is equal. So at any given time in League of Legends, you probably have this list of stuff in your mind that is more or less important, and they might be changing from moment to moment. So for example, something that might be really important before the team fight would be maybe how we set up before. But is that important during a team fight? Well, no, not really. An example in the laning phase could be, if you're thinking about your wards and stuff like that, that's not as important to think about when you're sitting at your tower as it's important to think about that when you're pushed up to the enemy tower. So not only is there all this stuff to think about, but we also need to find a way to kind of prioritize it in our mind so that we don't just get lost in thinking about literally everything and then missing things that are more important. So the way we're going to fix this is by creating some in-game habits, or what I like to call triggers. So triggers basically mean that whenever X happens, you think about Y. Essentially, when something happens in-game, it's going to be a reminder for you to think about something else. So let me give you some examples of triggers that I use in my games. One that I have is that whenever the new waves arrive, so when this wave comes and this wave comes, I have that as a trigger in my mind to think about, okay, what am I going to use this wave for? So every time a new wave comes, these waves meet in mid, I think, okay, what am I going to do with this wave? And this has done two big things for me. The first one is, if I've forgotten to think about what should I do with my wave, the in-game action of a wave arriving reminds me to think about that. And the second thing it does is it automatically puts, okay, what am I going to do with this wave, at the top of my priority list for things to think about at the time when it's most important to do so. Because if you're in the middle of a roam and you're thinking about what am I going to do with my next wave, that's kind of the wrong time to be thinking about it. But at this point, it's kind of the most important time for me to be deciding what I'm going to use this wave for. So some other examples of basic triggers could be that whenever you go past this halfway point in mid, that's when you start thinking about vision and wards. As I mentioned before, it's much less important to think about your vision and where you need to position in the lane, relative to your jungler and everything like that, when you're sitting under your tower, because simply put, you're just not very gankable when you're under your tower. But when you're past the halfway point in mid, it's pretty important. So a trigger that I like to have is whenever I walk past this halfway point in the lane, I need to start thinking about, okay, where is my vision? Where should I place wards and which side of the lane I should hug to? Another example of this later in the game could be that whenever you base in the mid game or whenever you come out of base in the mid game, that you think about what your lane assignments should be and which lane you should go to. Once again, this will remind us to think about our lane assignments if we're not thinking about them, and two, it'll put it at the top of our priority list when it's most important to be thinking about it. So something else you can consider is that triggers can also be time-based. So this is a bit more difficult because you have to look at the in-game clock, but if you've watched my warding guide, you'd probably know about warding at 2:30 and 4 minutes. So you can also use this later in the game around certain objectives. For example, the Herald spawning at 8 minutes, you might have a trigger to base at say 7:30 to make sure you're on the map for Herald. So you can also set up your triggers, your in-game actions with time instead, as long as you can pay attention to the in-game clock. You can also have triggers that are based around your opponent. So things like when my opponent uses a cooldown, I will look to trade or zone them off creeps. You might have when my opponent looks to CS, I will try and harass them. You might have when my opponent uses flash, I will time it in chat. It can be anything like that. If you want to get more advanced, you might also have your triggers be sequential. So for example, at 2:30, I place a ward, and then placing the ward is a trigger to think about which side of the lane I hug to. We could also do this with the example of pushing the wave before. When the new waves arrive, you could think, okay, should I push or freeze this wave? And then once you've chosen that decision, you can think about, okay, if I push this wave, what will I do? Or if I freeze this wave, what's my plan then? So how do you create triggers of your own? For this, we're going to need the old Shok notepad. And our first step is going to be start with what you want to think about. So some examples could be you want to think about punishing cooldowns. You want to think about hugging the correct side of the lane. You could think about important cooldowns in teamfights. It can be literally anything, and I really want to emphasize that the world is your oyster. It can be whatever you think you struggle with, whatever you have a hard time remembering to think about. The second thing is to create an in-game action that causes you to think about it. So some examples that I always use are stuff like waves. So you could have when waves meet, when waves die, when waves spawn. You could have when waves are cleared. You know, it could be a variety of different things to do with waves. It could even be like when your opponent catches a wave as opposed to like when you actually clear the wave. It could be when someone shows on a wave, like in a side lane. It could be when a wave gets pushed without vision. You know, there's a ton of different stuff you could do. Bases are also a good one. So for thinking about like, especially in the mid game, like what objectives next, like what lane assignments should be, you know, what items I should buy, as in like you could base and then think, okay, like let's identify their team comp. Let's see what mythic I need to build. Are there any situational items I need to build? So like if you don't do that in loading screen, you could sync that up with your bases. Objectives is another one. So you might use this in combination with the in-game clock. I'll actually add clock just to the list, but so what I'm thinking is stuff like if dragon's a minute 30 away, you might need to think about basing, or you might need to think about your drag setup, or that might be a trigger for you to think about how you want to play team fights. You could also have when an objective dies. So when you kill Baron, then you start thinking about like your post-Baron setup and stuff like that. The clock, we already talked about this one. You can actually just have timestamps in the game. So for example, warding at 2:30 and 4 minutes. You might also have basing, say, a minute before Herald spawns or 30 seconds before Herald spawns. You might also need to think about, okay, 14 minutes when plates die, 20 minutes when Baron is on the map. There's a lot of different stuff you can do with the clock. And finally, there's actions. So this can be literally just anything you want. I'm going to re-emphasize that. Anything you want. Any action that you can think of in the game, you can make into a trigger. So this could be when you place a ward. It could be when you roam. It could be when your jungler dies. It could be when you die. It could be when you get a solo kill. There's a million things. All that really matters for creating a trigger at the end of the day is that you have an in-game action which acts as a reminder and prioritizes your list. So it should remind you to do or think about whatever thing you're focusing on, and also it should prioritize your list. So if you're thinking about a ton of stuff at once, it should put this most important thing at the very top of your list. So how do we actually go about implementing this into our gameplay? So what I would recommend is having either a really good idea of what your trigger is just in your mind, or writing it down before the game. And then, like anything else, we're just going to isolate it and focus on it, break it down into steps. So first, we just want to actually notice our trigger happening. So for example, if we use the one that we said before about when the new waves arrive, we think about what we're going to use that wave for. So the first thing is just simply to notice the new wave arriving. So you might play a few games where your focus is specifically just to notice that Well, the new waves arrive every 30 seconds, and you just need to notice that, internalize it. You don't even need to attach the action to it, but once you've started noticing it happening every time, then you can attach the follow-up action. So you could say, okay, now that I notice that these waves actually arrive, when the waves arrive, I'm now going to think about, what am I going to use this wave for? And so then you might play a bunch of games. Let's say you play 10 to 20 games just building up this trigger. And that's pretty much all you need to do. You just need to, like any other skill, you isolate it, you break it down into steps, and you work on it. And you can do this. You can make your triggers as simple or as advanced as you want them to be. And you can create as many or as few as you want. So I'm sure there are players out there that have these without even realizing that they have them. But if you're a player like me that's very consciously developed them, I would say I have thousands of triggers that I've kind of built up over time. So I think that's a really good way to go about it. And I think it also really helps with being consistent. If you have these kind of things where you input the same action and you get the same outcome every time, it inherently makes you a very consistent player. So guys, that is going to be it for this video. I know it was a bit of a different video and perhaps not what you're expecting, but I think it is really, really important. And it's something that I think is kind of lacking from League content in general. I feel like there's a lot of stuff around kind of how to improve yourself actually gameplay wise, but then there isn't actually much talking about kind of how you improve at improving. And I think that's definitely something that I want to talk about kind of more in depth. And I think this kind of serves as a really good introduction to that, to kind of introduce you guys to some of the concepts that I use when improving. And I think this one will really help you guys a lot. So if you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe. Check out my socials and stuff as well, especially my stream. Would really appreciate that. But thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.